So moving to kilning and brewing quality. Tom Shellhammer, the Department of Food Science and Technology at Oregon State University. And I believe Lindsay Rubottom will be joining him, and she's a PhD student of Tom's.
You bet, exactly. Lindsay's she's the gal who is driving this project. I'm gonna let her present the results and the two of us can answer your questions. Take it away, Lindsay.
Hey. All right, can everyone hear me okay?
You bet.
All right, so I'm excited to be here to share some of the work I've gotten to work on in Tom's lab this year. Today I'm going to be discussing how kiln temperature impacts chemistry and hop quality. So to get started, I'm going to briefly go over our overall project goals. So right now there's 4 of them for this last harvest year. One was to determine how hops are affected by drying temperature during the kilning process. The other is to determine if there are sensory differences in beers made with hops kilned at different temperatures. And then the third is to evaluate how dynamic kilning temperature drying regimes might impact hop quality and hop enzyme capabilities. And then the fourth is to take this, the data from this multi-year project and compare across multiple harvest years. And so first I'm going to start by summarizing our 2019 project. When we last met in the summer meeting, we had started collecting sensory data for this project, and that's pretty much what I'm going to be presenting on today for this project, with the bulk of the material being focused on our 2020 project. So just as a reminder of what the 2020 or 2019 project was, we looked at 3 temperatures, 120, 140, 160 for 2 varieties for Simcoe and Amarillo. We did chemistry, enzyme, sensory, brewing performance analysis. And as I said, we're going to be talking about the sensory data from those beers that we brewed. So for the sensory evaluation, we used a method called difference from control, or DFC, where a panelist is given a control sample and multiple blind coded samples, where they then compare each of those blind coded samples to the control. And so if they think a sample is different from the control, they'll give it a high DFC score, like 5 to 7. And if they don't think it's very different from the control, it'll be anywhere from 0 to 1.5 or 2. So here are our sensory results. So on the x-axis is DFC score, and on the y-axis is our temperature treatment, with each of the treatments being outlined on that axis, where Amarillo is on the top 2 and Simcoe is on the bottom 2 plots. Noticing that the top row in each of these for the treatments is a strata sample. So we intentionally placed a sample that we knew was different from the variety in the test to ensure that our panelists are able to identify large differences if large differences are present. And you can see in all 4 cases that the panel was pretty good at determining that there was a very different sample from the control, which is to be expected. So now we're just going to focus on the 120, 140, 160 in control treatments, where highlighted in red for the top 2 plots for Amarillo are the 2 treatments within Amarillo that were found to be statistically different from the control. So for farm A, that was the 140 treatment, and for farm B, that was the 160 treatment. This was determined using a Dunnett means comparison. And then for Simcoe, we found that there was no statistical significant difference between the control and the other temperature treatments. So overall for that project, we found higher kiln temperature can reduce drying time. Kiln temperature didn't have a large impact on hop quality, and sensory only appeared to be modestly affected for Amarillo, and enzymatic power was significantly reduced. So now we're going to jump into the bulk of this presentation, which is our harvest year 2020 projects. So first we're going to go over our 130 versus 150 drying project. The goal of this project was to investigate how kiln temperature may impact popular hop aroma varieties, and then distribute these samples to brewers for sensory and brewing evaluations in order to get feedback on how temperature might impact brewing quality. So for this project, we looked at 6 varieties: Cascade, Centennial, Amarillo, Citra, Mosaic, and Simcoe. These were dried in commercial scale kilns at 130 and 150, and we didn't have any replication. So before we jump into talking about the hop chemistry, I just want to remind everyone of the metric that we use to look at the hop chemistry, where we look at the drying or the measure of an analyte at 130 relative to 150 to get a number called fold change, where a fold change of 1 means that there was no change in that analyte drying at 150 relative to 130. And if it's lower than 1, that means that there was a decrease in that analyte. And if it's larger than 1, that means that there was an increase in that analyte. This is our hop chemistry results for the 6 different varieties, where the x-axis is the fold change and the y-axis is the analyte for each of these plots. And briefly, you can see that for the most part, Amarillo, Cascade, Citra, and Mosaic weren't really impacted terribly by temperature treatment. Where we do see impacts in primarily reductions with respect to temperature treatment is in Centennial and Simcoe. Now, moving on to talk about hop grind sensory. For hop grind sensory, we used a discrimination method called a triangle test, where a panelist is presented with 3 blind coded samples where 2 are the same and 1 is different, and they're asked to select the odd sample. This evaluation was made up of 3 different panels. So we had the OSU Brewing class, our OSU trained panel, and then with the help of Tiffany Petra at Yakima Chief Hops, their panel also evaluated these samples. So we're gonna primarily be looking at the bottom row of each of these tables, so the combined results. So what we found for Amarillo is the 130 and the 150 treatment were not found to be different from each other. But in Cascade and Centennial, the 130 and 150 treatment were found to be different from each other. Now looking at Citra, Mosaic, and Simcoe, we found that the 130 treatment and the 150 treatment were not different from each other. So for this project overall, we found that some varieties seem to be temperature sensitive while others are not, and Cascade and Centennial hop aroma appears to be impacted by kilning temperature while the other varieties were not. So now we're going to move into talking about our next project focused on dynamic kilning drying regimes. So the goal of this project was to gather preliminary data on how dynamic kilning can be used to mitigate hop creep while preserving hop quality, and then gain understanding on energy metrics surrounding drying. So we did this project at Elk Mountain in Bonners Ferry, Idaho, looking at Cascade on pilot scale kilns. And then we have 6 different temperature regimes here, where we have treatment A being like our lowest temperature treatment, with it being 130 degrees static drying, where treatment F is our highest temperature treatment with 160 degrees static drying, and B through E being dynamic in that they have more than 1 drying temperature being used, a combination of 130 and 160, and being 160 at different time points. 130 was selected as our low temperature because it was kind of a good like middle of the road standard like drying temperature in the industry, where 160 we have found in our previous 2 years of work is a temperature where we see some level of reduction in enzymes as far as the enzymes that cause hop creep. So for this plot here, we have a time versus temperature plot. Now these are actual collected data from the plenum of the kiln, where we measured air on temperature throughout drying in the plenum. So we just get an idea of what the temperature profile looks like during drying. While we didn't measure energy consumption specifically, we're able to use these plots to get like an estimate on what the energy input might look like for these different treatments. So what we did is we calculated the area under the curve for each of these to get a function in degree hours. And you can see for like treatment B, where it's at 160 for a brief amount of time and then 130 for most of the drying, that was about 63,000 degree hours, where for treatment E, we have 58,000 degree hours, noticing that while treatment E was at a higher temperature longer, it has a much shorter drying time and therefore has a lower energy input. So we took those estimates and then plotted them versus drying time. And you could see for treatment F here, on the left-hand side, it took about 5.5 hours to dry and has the lowest energy input, where treatment A, that 130 static, takes 8 hours to dry and has one of the higher energy inputs, with C, D, and E having slowly decreasing energy inputs with respect to decreasing drying times, with treatment B having the highest energy input, which being the treatment where the kiln is at 160 until the middle of the bed gets to 130 and then drop down to 130 for the rest of drying. Now we're going to move into talking about the hop chemistry. So for basic hop chemistry like total oil, hop storage index, alpha acid, and beta acid, we didn't see that temperature had an impact, or temperature treatment had an impact on those analytes. Now, for oil composition, generally most analytes were not impacted by temperature, but we did see some increase in caryophyllene oxide and epoxide with respect to exposure to 160-degree air, where we do see some slight increases in those treatments, especially C through E. Now, for hop enzymes, so these enzymes that we are associating with hop creep, with increased exposure to 160-degree air, we see reduction in those enzyme activities. Now, to date, we've found that any amount of time at 160 reduces drying time, lower temperature results in longer drying time, but increased energy usage. And hop chemistry, most analytes weren't impacted, and for enzymes, the increased exposure to 160 resulted in lower enzymatic activity. And I'd like to point out that the drying and energy data portion of this is kind of preliminary work and background to the work we're going to be working on in 2021 harvest, kind of outlining energy metrics surrounded with or associated with kilning. Now we're going to talk about one other 2020 project where we looked at the temperature impacts on high thiol precursor hops. For this project, we worked with Hopsteiner. We looked at 135, 145, and 150 as drying temperatures, looking at Apollo, Bravo, Lemon Drop, Lotus, and Sultana. These were all dried in commercial scale kilns with the exception of Bravo, where it was in a pilot kiln, and there was no replication done. To date, we have the chemistry analysis finished, and then we'll be having thiol analysis done, which is being funded by Hopsteiner in support of this project. And then we'll be doing enzyme analysis and hop grind sensory evaluations. So like I said, today we have the chemistry results. So this is the same kind of fold change plot that you saw in the 130 versus 150 section, where the x-axis is fold change and the y-axis is analyte. So for Apollo, we saw some increases in some of the analytes. For Bravo, we have some increases, but we have more analytes being reduced by kiln temperature treatment. For Lemon Drop, we see decreases in many of the analytes with respect to drying temperature. For Lotus, we saw variable reductions and increases in analytes. And for Sultana, we don't see very much change with respect to drying treatment as far as its chemistry analytes. And to wrap this presentation up, I just want to thank everybody who's been a part of this project and helped out along the way. Without all of you guys, it wouldn't be possible to do this work. So I thank you, and we thank you. At this point, I'd like to open the floor to questions.
Thank you, Lindsay. That was a lot of information in a short period of time. So we have time for a question or two.
We did have a question come in the Q&A box from John. The question is, how did you identify hop cultivars that were high in thiol precursor?
So we actually took the advice of Paul Matthews and the group at Hopsteiner as to what varieties to look at in this study, in that part of the study.
A question from Ryan. If you set up your kiln for Centennial, how would you do it? If you set up your own kiln for Centennial, how would you do it?
I wouldn't say that I really have a stake in knowing how to dry particular cultivars. But from our data so far, we've seen some trendings that Centennial might be temperature sensitive. So we're going to need to do further sensory evaluations on brewing quality and descriptive to kind of figure out why those temperature treatments might be different from each other.
Yeah, I'd also point out that this 130, 150 study is an unreplicated study. So we've done a fair amount of replication, both within years and between years for the Simcoe Amarillo studies. But this is sort of our first go at these other varieties. So it's like, I would take the result with a little bit of either caution or skepticism.
All right, with 1 minute left in the session, last call for questions. I'll check the box here again. Looks like we're caught up on questions.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation. So this concludes the presentations by the researchers. We're going to have a short 15-minute break, and following this will be poster presentations by the authors. And so if you've not visited the virtual poster presentations, I would encourage you to. There's a tremendous amount of information there.